It's one of the most brilliant, straightforward, and practical pieces of instruction the Bible gives on how to live a life of meaning, purpose, and fulfillment. Yet, I'll bet you've never heard of it. There's a succinct piece of scripture explicitly about how you ought to walk in order to please God. I'm talking practical steps day to day that will help you live a life of more meaning and fulfillment. It breaks out into four simple parts, an easy framework. It tells us what we ought to aspire to, how we can achieve that, why it matters, and ultimately what you can expect if you go about doing these things. In a way that makes it the perfect antidote to modern life and the low grade stress we're always dealing with. Now, this verse is extremely countercultural. That's part of the reason we're so blind to it and we don't hear it talked about a lot. But it's also timeless advice. It applied 2,000 years ago and it still applies to this very day. What's amazing about this verse is that it's backed by science. I'm talking decades of research. And what I love is that it's so easy to empirically verify. Go out there and do this stuff on your own, and you'll feel the results right away. So without further ado, let's get into what I call the Homesteader's verse. Now, before we dive right in, I've got kind of a rule where I don't like talking about a piece of scripture without providing the context surrounding it. So what we're going to read comes from Thessalonians. Thessalonians is a letter from Paul to the church in Thessaloniki. And basically, he's using this letter to encourage the Thessalonians. He tells them they're doing a good job and they should do more and more of that. And we get to chapter 4, and he specifically says, you guys are doing a great job exhibiting brotherly love. Do this more and more. And then he gets right into what I call the Homesteader's verse. So let's read what it says. This is 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, and we're going to look at verse 11 and 12, which says, to aspire to live quietly and to mind your own affairs and to work with your hands as we instructed you, so that you may walk properly before outsiders and be dependent on no one. So that's the Homesteader's verse in its entirety. So let's go through it piece by piece, and hopefully you'll find something you can apply from the Homesteader's verse. The first part of the Homesteader's verse says to aspire to live quietly and to mind your own affairs. And this is the what part of the framework, which is basically answering the question, what are we supposed to be trying to do? This is really counterintuitive to the modern American because we're taught to be loud, to be the center of attention, to make a difference, to get noticed, to stand out. And this is probably the biggest reason that I was completely blind to the Homesteader's verse for, well, basically up until 2 or 3 years ago when I first discovered it and kind of saw it as a way that our family was aspiring to live. So what aspire to live quietly and mind your own affairs means is to focus on your own little sphere of influence. And the truth is the sphere of influence we're given is not actually that large. And you might think, well, I manage 300 people or I own a big company or something like that. What I'm talking about is the very lasting influence, the eternal influence that you have. And that's really, really, really going to be limited to things like your wife, your kids, your home, your immediate property. These are the things where you add lasting, meaningful value, where people might actually listen to you, change the way they see the world, change the way they behave, change what they believe because of you and your impact. Very rarely are you going to have that kind of impact on, for example, an employee or a coworker. So minding your own affairs, aspiring to live quietly is saying, do I focus and attend to that 10 times more than I do anything else? And it doesn't necessarily mean with 10 times more time, but it does mean 10 times the intensity, 10 times the quality of energy and effort. And I think that is where we find we're often most lacking because we don't attend to our little sphere of influence and mind our own affairs very well, do we? Very rarely are we actually present where our body is at any given moment. And that is exactly what mind your own affairs is talking about. It'd be easy to interpret it as mind your own business, butt out of what your neighbor's doing. And it does encompass some of that. But the positive way to see this, the what should you be striving towards instead of what are you running away from, is you've got to be focused and present and attentive to the things you actually have an impact on. And you got to stop tricking yourself into thinking that those things are the things that the world tells you should strive to have an impact on. So if you can understand that about aspiring to live quietly, minding your own affairs, and how that means just being attentive to that little sphere of influence, the next big question in practical terms is, well, how do I do that on a day-to-day basis? And that brings us to the second part of the Homesteader's verse, where Paul says, work with your hands. Now, again, working with your hands is completely counterintuitive to our culture. We don't really celebrate manual labor in America. We think of ourselves as the knowledge workers. We're supposed to be the engineers and the architects. We're not supposed to be the people working on the assembly line or laying bricks with our hands. But why does Paul say work with your hands? Is he talking only to the people 2,000 years ago? I would argue absolutely not. Working with your hands is how you mind your own affairs. It means, as a physically embodied being, physically connecting to creation. And that's so essential. It almost sounds stupid, and yet somehow we take it for granted. We take it for granted that we are material beings. God created us that way, and He said it was good. We live in a material world, but we spend all of our time today in the abstract, in our heads, looking at digital media, digital things on screens, or contemplating ideas and then typing them out onto a PowerPoint. Very little of our time, if you're an average American, is actually spent connected to creation, outside, working on something physical. And I'm telling you, as an embodied being, you cannot downplay that aspect. You cannot be a full human living with integrity, wholeness, if you don't go out there and interact physically with the world. We talk about having dominion, so at the very least, we owe it to our subjects, the things we have dominion over in the physical world, to go out there, to mingle with them, to care about them, to know what's going on. We make fun of people who are leaders in Washington, D.C., who never get outside the Beltway, and they say clueless things because they're so out of touch. We mock them, and rightfully so. But then we turn around and we stay in our own ivory towers inside of our own Beltway, and we barely get out there and get to know our subjects. Now, what I really like about the concept of working with your hands is there's so much scientific evidence to back it up. If you go and you research the topic of embodied cognition, it's all about this idea that as a physically embodied being, your physical posture, your physical movements, your physical environment all impact your ability to think. And so that's the idea behind embodied cognition, and actually supports this idea that you got to work with your hands. And if you work with your hands, it'll actually clarify your thinking. It'll actually make you better at focus and better at attention, two supremely important things that we're utterly lacking today. There's also plenty of research and a strong link between the physical body, physical movement, and flow. Now, it's not impossible to get into flow by doing mental work and things like coding or writing a book, but a shortcut to flow is doing something physical. That's why athletes are some of the people that experience more flow than anybody else. When you're concentrating on physical movement, getting that feedback in the real world, and bringing your mind to bear simultaneously, it's such a blissful state that it's hard to describe. I hope everybody that's watching this has at least had at some point in their life something where they were able to achieve a flow state, so you know what I'm talking about. And you don't just have to take my word for it, because another thing I love about the work with your hands idea is that it's so easy to empirically verify. I mean, you can go out there, try next time, instead of buying something from the store, whether it's, I don't know, a bird feeder or a shelf or a crate for storing stuff in your closet, try to actually do it yourself. Now, assuming that you're not biting off way more than you can chew, I guarantee you're going to get a sense of satisfaction, of concentration and attention and flow. And the research behind that is huge too. The idea that attention shapes not only who we are, but how we perceive the world and what the world ends up meaning to us. It's all about what you attend to. And again, it's empirically verifiable. Don't take my word for it. Go out there and actually do it. And by all means, if you don't get something out of it, hammer me in the comments, dislike the video, do whatever you got to do, because I can pretty much guarantee if you do this right, you will feel a sense of satisfaction. So what are the easy, practical ways to do this? Well, like I said, it might be as simple as, if you got a leaky faucet, fix it yourself. If you need to build a shelf, build a simple shelf. Maybe it's not going to look as nice as the one you can order online or something like that, but it'll be your shelf. And I guarantee you, you will feel a sense of pride and satisfaction about that shoddy looking, well, it doesn't have to be shoddy looking, but that cheap looking shelf, or that unfinished looking shelf, let's just call it rustic, that you would never get if you went and bought it from IKEA or something like that. Working with your hands forces the mind to focus, because you've got this tactile thing that's real. So you're using more senses than just your mind and your thinking. And as you interact with this real physical material world that you were made to be a part of, you're getting instantaneous feedback. There's no such thing as snap to grid when you're building a bird feeder. You either get the pieces squared and true and they fit together nicely and they do the job, or they don't. And if they do the job, it's very satisfying. You know right away it did the job. It's not a PowerPoint where everybody's going to subjectively evaluate your bullets. If it doesn't do the job, you know right away it didn't do the job. And because it's real, there's nice, clear feedback on what you can do to fix it and get better. So again, those of you who do this kind of stuff on a regular basis, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Put a comment in, encourage your brothers and sisters, let them know that what I'm talking about is real. But if you haven't done it before, no matter how small, I guarantee you're going to feel a tremendous sense of fulfillment and meaning when you finally embrace the fact that you are a physical being and that doing stuff in the physical world is a huge part of what God created you to do. And the third piece of the Homesteaders verse answers the why. Well, why does that matter? You know, I can aspire to this and I get there's meaning and fulfillment, but why? Why not just embrace a couch potato life watching Netflix if that seems fun to me? And the reason is so that you may walk properly before outsiders. Now, as Christians, you already know you're supposed to walk properly before outsiders, but it's still a little unintuitive to us as Americans because we have this attitude where we go for shock value. Like if you want to be a celebrity, you see them doing it all the time. They dress in atrocious, disgusting, perverted costumes. They say and do the most shocking things. It's all about giving everybody the finger and saying, I don't care what you think. I'm so unique, so original, such a standout. I do whatever I want, and what you think doesn't even matter. And there's a lot of people that admire that. They go, oh man, I wish I could be like that person, not have to worry what anybody thinks. So this verse comes at us unintuitively because it's saying, well, yeah, you should kind of consider what other people think because you're supposed to walk properly before outsiders. So in its simplest form, what Paul's talking about here is twofold. One, it's you're a representative of Christ. So whatever you're doing out there, people know you're a Christian, and whatever they see you do, they're going to go, that's what a Christian does. And then the second part is you are pointing the way back to God. So whenever these people do say, okay, you're a Christian, you represent Christ. Now, the way you live your life is interesting to me. I'd like to learn more. That gives you the opportunity to point the way back to God and to say, hey, look, the way I live is rooted in these principles. You can even refer them right back to the Homesteaders verse if you wanted to. You could say it's rooted in these principles. This tells me to live this way, and I got to tell you, it's pretty darn satisfying when I get it right. Of course, none of us, especially including me, get it right all the time. We're all hypocrites to some degree, but we got to get past the cowardice of not trying. Walk properly before outsiders doesn't mean be perfect, but it means making that attempt, and it means owning up to it when you don't. And so when you live that way, the what that we've talked about and the how that we've talked about literally set the example. People are going to see that, and for the reasons I already talked about, how non-intuitive that is in American culture, they're going to take notice. And I think more people than ever today want that kind of lifestyle. I think we could all do with a little more simplicity, with a little more of a quiet life. Now, if you do all these things, there's a natural result you're going to get, which Paul says. He says, and be dependent on no one. Now, it's going to be really hard to be dependent on no one if you haven't embraced minding your own affairs, if you haven't learned to work with your hands and you're building the skills and the confidence and the connection to reality that enables. This is a counterintuitive idea also in the way that Paul presents it, because I would say Americans are okay with independence, obviously. So what's counterintuitive is this. The way we approach it in America tends to be from a very prideful, self-centered perspective. The idea of independence is, I'm so tough, I've got it all figured out, I don't need your help, I'll go it alone. Does that sound about right? But the independence Paul's talking about, yeah, it can mean you can support yourself, and that's a good thing. It can mean you're doing stuff for yourself. You don't have to rely on others. But what Paul's really getting at is the flip side of this. He's saying you should be dependent on no one so you're not a burden to them. That flips around the equation entirely. It puts others first, which again, a little non-intuitive for us, isn't it? So Paul means not to be a burden to others first and foremost when he talks about be dependent on no one. The more you can do for yourself, the less you have to rely on others, and the more you are the person that others can rely on. And that's the critical flip side here. It's better to be the person who in a crisis, others know you're stable. You can take care of yourself. You can handle yourself across the board. You are the one that they can go to when they're falling to pieces and afraid and don't know what to do. I would rather be that guy than the guy who has to go and run to somebody else and says, I don't know what's going on. I don't know what to do next. Please help me. And yes, there's definitely a secondary benefit around being prepared, being anti-fragile, being able to withstand and weather disasters and crises and chaos. And yes, Paul is talking about not having to be dependent on government and other man-made institutions, that the more you're dependent on them, the more they have control over you. You're going to have to say things and do things, or shut up and not say things and do things that you know you ought to do in order to keep on getting whatever those benefits are, whatever those privileges are that they grant you, because you're not taking care of them yourself. So this idea of being independent ties everything back together, right? You focus on your little kingdom. You work with your hands. By doing this, you're setting a good example, walking properly before outsiders, and you become that rock by being dependent on no one. You become that rock and that stabilizing force in your community that others can rely on. So everything we've already talked about in the Homesteader's verse, the idea of being able to focus again, getting your attention span back so you can mind your own little kingdom, the kind of flow state and connection to reality and to nature, to your subjects that you have dominion over by working with your hands. All of this stuff ends up being a part of how you become more independent. So that's the Homesteader's verse. And again, what I love about it is how practical it is. It's something that you can start doing something on right now, today. And it's something where you get instant feedback on too. You're going to know right away that it's working. And so I'm not telling you you're going to get overnight transformation, and you shouldn't be seeking that. But what you're trying to do is lay the groundwork with tiny little habits that you can start to build on and get bigger and bigger and bigger. Maybe you're somebody that already fixes the shelf or the faucet, so you need to take on a bigger challenge. Maybe you need to get into the wall and mess with the plumbing the next time something like that comes up. Maybe that's pushing your skill level. But wherever you are, you can always push it a little bit further. That's why this verse is so relevant to everybody. It doesn't matter if you're seeking the homesteader lifestyle or not. So I hope this verse means as much to you as it did to me. Would love to hear from you. So please drop a comment if you agree, disagree, feedback, or anything else. Like and subscribe if you like this kind of thing and you want to see more. Definitely helps me out. So your support helps me justify my continuance. Now, if you're somebody like me, I often find it helpful. I make a lot of my own clothes and stuff, and I put slogans and ideas on there that I know I need to be reminded of every time I look in the mirror. We created this neat design with the Homesteaders verse logo, and we have shirts like this already that we like to wear around. If you feel like something like this would be useful to you, there's a link in the description where you can pick up one of these t-shirts. So if that interests you, check it out. We've got some mugs and some other stuff there too. All right, so that's it. Homesteader's verse. Have a great day.